everyone, welcome to the Danmei 101, an introduction to Chinese BL panel. I'm your host Jemima. So let's start with just the very basic terminology. So the word Danmei is the word for Chinese BL. Yuandan is the term for original works of Danmei fiction, so basically Danmei that is not fan fiction. We're talking about just original stories. But Danmei fanfiction is known as Danmei Tongren. And Fu Nu, or Rotten Women, is obviously the Chinese word for fujoshi. It comes from the Japanese fujoshi. Bai He is the female counterpart to Danmei, so Yuri or girl's love essentially. Now, let's get on to some history. So, Danmei is obviously reborrowed from the Japanese word tanbi, which means sort of aestheticism, and the word Danmei itself means indulging in beauty as a rough translation. And in China, the word Danmei and BL are pretty much used interchangeably, although Danmei is typically the preferred term, but either works totally fine. So, Danmei is probably one of the youngest and sort of continuously emergent types of BL. So its origins start in the 1990s. It was essentially when BL, so that is Japanese BL, was introduced to mainland China via pirated Taiwanese translations. The community at the very beginning were essentially Chinese fans of Japanese BL. But as the years kind of progressed, people naturally would start to develop their own stories, write them, create them, etc. A lot of what was written and produced initially was sort of fan stuff, so like fan fiction, fan art, etc. for Japanese BL. And it was about 1998 where the very first original Danmei novel was published online. This is known in English as Beijing Comrades. The English translation cover is on the screen here. I really do recommend people read this. Fair warning, it is not a happy ending. It's very much rooted in reality. It's the story of a man in the 1980s, about 1987, who is struggling with his sexuality very heavily and sort of starts an affair with a much younger man, about their sort of dynamic and how they navigate their sexuality, with the younger one being the one who is able to more accept and embrace himself, whereas the older man is the one who really struggles and is sort of covertly trying to conversion therapy himself out of it. It's a very realistic portrayal of how a lot of gay men experienced the world and felt within themselves at the time, and it's been highly praised by pretty much everyone. Very tragic, but very beautifully written, and there is actually a movie version that you can watch completely free on YouTube. A movie adaptation was made in the early 2000s. Very beautifully done. I have provided a link to it in the handout, so if you would like to watch that, I really urge that you do, especially for those of you who have a general interest in sort of LGBT history and especially sort of film history as well. It's definitely a worthwhile thing, but do keep in mind that it is not a happy read. It is very heartbreaking, but in the sort of most real way. And then about a year later, in 1999, several online fan-run Danmei forums had been established. Fan-run forums where people would come together to discuss Danmei, to share Danmei, etc. So very much a budding niche community is emerging. And in that same year, the very first print magazine devoted to Danmei, called Danmei Season, was founded. And this magazine actually ran for 14 years, only discontinued back in 2013. So it had a pretty good run. And then we move on to the early 2000s, where the sort of budding niche community, although still niche, is sort of really starting to expand within online circles. And so these previously fan-run communities were gradually being replaced by commercial online fiction websites. The largest of these websites, and the one that is still the sort of dominant force in the genre, is Jinjiang Literature City, or JJWWC for short. And this was founded in 2003. And this site isn't just for Danmei, it does include both original works and fan fiction, LGBT romance, as well as other genres, including heterosexual romance. But it is most well known for its original Danmei novels. And so we continue into the 2010s, where we really start to see the community start to really grow, and growing outside of China. So before the kind of 2010s, it was very much China-based. You would occasionally get a few outsiders, but because it was all in Chinese, very inaccessible for most people unless they obviously had previous language skills. But the 2010s saw the rise of fan translations being publicly shared online, and these are what caused international fans to start growing and to really get the attention overseas. And then, as that continued to grow, we get the very first Danmei novel adaptation in 2016. And this was a live-action web series adaptation of Are You Addicted? And we will talk more about this later. Keep this in mind, because there is a lot to say about this show. But 2016, first Danmei to get a web series adaptation, so a very big moment here. And Addicted gained a lot of its success and a lot of attention for reasons we will get into later, but because of how well it did, we see an influx of Danmei adaptations emerging from 2018 onwards. Now, these adaptations, unlike Addicted, were censored, so not very explicit in its queerness, although definitely varying degrees of subtext there. And the most sort of notable of these adaptations is Guardian in 2018. I know for a lot of people this was their very first introduction to Danmei, especially those who came from, BL fandom elsewhere. I do remember seeing a lot of hype around Guardian in sort of yaoi circles around this time in some pockets. And then there was The Untamed in 2019, which is probably the one that really got the international attention grabbed. Probably if any of you who are very new to Danmei have heard of any Danmei, there is a very good chance The Untamed is probably one of the ones that you have indeed heard of. It gained massive worldwide attention, not just in BL spaces, but just general population. I'm not sure if it still is, but it was available on Netflix, so very much accessible. And then in 2021, there was Word of Honor that also achieved global success. And combined, all of these series received billions of views and a very broad international distribution, with some countries even selling DVD releases and the like. And because of the success of all of these adaptations, film and television producers ended up purchasing the rights to 59 Danmei titles in 2020 alone. That's a lot. So you can really see how the success of these stories really gained the attention of the film and television industry in China. They were very eager to jump on this train. Now, because of this, and because of the growing interest in Danmei from these adaptations, the 2020s saw official English publications of Danmei novels beginning to be announced from a number of different publishers, with Seven Seas probably being the biggest. And at the same time, translations in other languages were also announced. So, however, because of the very high licensing fees in order to get these novels published, a lot of these translations were actually crowdfunded by fans. That's a very, very brief overview of the sort of history of Danmei, how it emerged, how it developed. Now, one of the things that I get asked the most when I talk about Danmei is what makes it unique from other types of BL, especially in comparison to Japanese BL, Korean BL, Thai BL, etc. So, I think that while obviously its sort of Japanese origins and influence cannot be overstated and certainly shouldn't be disregarded, Danmei is really unique in that it has really carved itself out as a genre that is uniquely Chinese, unequivocally Chinese. You cannot separate China from Danmei. It truly is an intertwined thing, and writers have really made this thing their own. It's really incredible to see. Danmei is unique in that it's predominantly created in the web novel format, whereas obviously Japanese BL and Korean BL, predominantly comics, Thai BL, predominantly live action series. Danmei is almost exclusively, at least the original works, is almost exclusively web novel format originally. And original comics, in contrast, are actually incredibly rare. And again, we will talk about why in a little bit, but that already sets it apart. So what I mean by that is that, for example, unlike BL from other countries, and within this prose, it is so deeply rooted in Chinese storytelling. So a lot of the way that it is written, a lot of the stories, the plot, the characters, everything about it really pulls from classical Chinese literature and folklore. So we're talking, from classic texts to Journey of the West, The Three Kingdoms, Dream of the Red Chamber, etc. Jin Yong's work. You can really see how influenced Danmei authors are by their literary history and culture. An example of this is that oftentimes the written structure of Danmei stories are similar to Huaben stories. So though Huaben are sort of short to medium length novellas that are often written in sort of a vernacular language, and are not necessarily written in chapters, but more as sort of continuous stories that go into detail about different characters and sort of side plots and backgrounds that all sort of merge together. Although obviously not all of them follow this structure. Obviously the focus will be on the main couple, but side characters, you will get a ton of backstory from them. You will get, a lot of lore, a lot of world building as well. Another aspect of Danmei storytelling is, unlike a lot of Western stories and stories from other cultures where you're sort of encouraged to do the show don't tell rule in your prose, a lot of Danmei actually has less emphasis on that and actually gives a lot more tells in order to give the reader further insight into characters and their feelings. And then obviously tropes, character archetypes, themes, genres are all very Chinese, very commonplace. We will get to a couple of those in a little bit so you can see a bit more in what I mean, but When I say these stories are explicitly Chinese, I mean that you really cannot separate its Chineseness from Danmei. Because of this, as well, a lot of Danmei writers often use Danmei as a vehicle to express their own political views and social views, as well as criticisms in a sort of safe manner. And this is due to, obviously, most of us are aware that the Chinese government is pretty heavy when it comes to sort of policing internet usage. And so a lot of authors have taken to using Danmei as a means to have their voice be heard and really freely express their views in a way that's difficult to do in the standard way. And of course, there are many complex storylines and multi-layered metaphors and allegories in many Danmei stories, as is common in the Chinese literary tradition. We're going to talk a bit more about the web novel medium now, and how and why it is so important when it comes to Danmei. So, aside from its literary roots, as we just discussed, the web novel actually has very much historically allowed more freedom than traditional publishing. Although this is unfortunately rapidly changing, which I will go into more detail soon. With these novels being published online, it obviously gives authors a bit more wiggle room, and way less hurdles than trying to traditionally publish their works would be. So, in many ways, we can actually view these authors as acting in a sort of rebellion against state censorship, because if there's one thing Chinese netizens are very good at doing, it's swerving the censors and finding ways to circumvent these issues. This also explains why it is so rare for original Danmei to come in comic formats compared to Japanese and Korean BL, because there's more wiggle room when it comes to just written prose as opposed to, a visual piece of art. Although many Danmei have in fact received comic adaptations, but these are of course adaptations and not the original content being created. Prose is definitely the easiest and most accessible to do, although as I said, this is sadly rapidly changing for reasons we will be getting into. Web novels are very interesting because they work sort of like 19th century serial fiction does. So for those of you who studied Charles Dickens at school, you may remember how you were taught that he actually serialized his novels. So he would serialize them in magazines and newspapers with a chapter coming out in every issue, and readers would have to buy the next issue in order to learn what happened next in his books. And, he would take audience reactions into account when he'd write the new chapter. Works very similarly. So Chinese web novels work so that readers typically pay per new chapter as they're being released, or they can wait until everything's been published, and then they can just purchase the entire novel in full in one flat rate. Totally up to them. When these completed novels are published online, they will, if they attract enough attention and make enough money, they will sometimes be published as physical editions, so physical books. This is either via self-publishing or via a Taiwanese publisher, because Taiwan is not under the strict censorship laws that mainland China. And then, as I said before, the most popular novels are often adapted into manhua, which is the Chinese word for comics, donghua, which is animation, anime, whatever you want to call it, audio dramas, and live action series, which, as we've said, may or may not retain textual queer elements. Okay, so let's talk about the key characteristics of Danmei and what makes them unique. So, Danmei novels are written in a very wide variety of genres. Think of a genre, there's a bunch of Danmei, so we're talking historical fiction, crime, drama, slice of life, sci-fi, fantasy, Omegaverse, sports, soap opera, literally anything. Now, three of the most common uh, genres that we find in Danmei are actually specifically Chinese literary genres. So we have wuxia, which is a genre of Chinese fiction that concerns the adventures of martial artists in ancient China. So this is very deeply rooted in martial arts. It has its own literary category in its own right. For those of you who have seen the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, that's wuxia. It's probably the most globally well-known wuxia story. So if you're familiar with that movie, you already have some exposure to this genre. In the West, they're often just called martial arts movies. You guys may remember in the 90s where Hong Kong martial arts movies were incredibly popular. A lot of those were also in the wuxia genre. So again, if you've seen those, you're already kind of familiar. There is Shanxia, which is a fantasy subgenre of wuxia, and that has a lot of heavy Taoist and cultivation themes, as well as things like magic. In this context, cultivation refers to the traditional Taoist belief that if you cultivate your qi through meditation and other ways, you can actually gain supernatural like abilities, as well as even ascend to immortality and maybe even become a god as well. So that's what cultivation means in this context. So there's also a lot of dealings with the ghost realm, the heavenly realm, and the cosmos in Shanxia as well. So very expansive fantasy subgenre. The third genre is transmigration, which I believe more of you will probably be at least somewhat familiar with. So this is a subgenre or where a character from one world or realm enters the body of someone in a different world or realm, and this is similar to Japanese isekai stories. Another key characteristic are the sort of top and bottom dynamics. So characters are often divided into the gong, or the top, and the sho, the bottom. These are sort of similar to Japanese seme and uke dynamics. And, some works will go for the hugong, so characters who both take active roles. So basically, switches, verse, whatever you want to call it. Now, traditionally, most Danmei have done the classic gongsho dynamic. However, since the sort of mid-2010s, expansion to include a wider variety of relationship dynamics has occurred, although the usual gongsho model does remain the sort of dominant structure, and this is what you will see most of the time, unless you actively seek out a different dynamic. As I said, gong is the word for top or the seme, and the word literally translates to attacker. The sho is the bottom or the uke, that literally translates to receiver. You get the gist. The hugong or the mutually attacking character is a switch or reverse. And then just to go over some common abbreviations that you will see in Danmei circles. So CP refers to couple. I know in English the acronym CP does not have any good connotation whatsoever. Please don't be alarmed when you see it in Danmei circles though. MC, main character. And the ML is the male lead, so this is almost always, although not every single time, the ML is the MC's love interest. So 3P, a threesome, 4P, a foursome, etc. And then an NP is essentially a gangbang. The N in this context is just meant to be a stand-in for a high number of people. How many gays does it take to make a gangbang? Like, that old classic question. So some more common terms and phrases you will see is HE and BE. These stand for happy ending and bad ending respectively. In Danmei context, happy ending just means that the two main leads end up together, and the bad ending means that the two main leads do not end up together. That's all that means. It does not necessarily mean that the ship itself is a healthy or good ship. That is not what happy or bad means in this context. It just means that they end up together. So even if it's a toxic ship that ends up together, that's still considered a happy ending. So, whether the ship is healthy or good is irrelevant in this context. And then some other terms that you will see when talking about different types of Danmei. You may see the term dog blood. This is used to refer to stories that are very OTT, very soap opera-like, think sort of telenovela, where there's excessive melodrama, heightened emotions, and lots of tragedy in an extremely tropey and cliched way, essentially. And then we have the wife-chasing crematorium. So this is used to refer to a story where the male protagonist basically decides he's bored for whatever reason with his partner, ignores them, it treats them badly, indifferently, arrogantly, sometimes even abusively for whatever reason. But due to his attitude or due to other circumstances, he ends up losing his lover for whatever reason, and then has to go through a series of redemption, usually in the means of groveling, in order to win them back, because he realized how much he truly loved them the whole time. This is a very popular type of story. And usually it's the gongs or the top who is the one who needs to do the groveling. And then we have unlimited flow. This refers to a story where the characters get transported to a death game or a sort of an escape room type world where they have to survive or solve some sort of puzzle stage in order to move on to the next. So think Squid Game, Alice in Borderland, things like that. And then we have satisfaction or feel good. This is a term to describe essentially the degree you, the reader, derived satisfaction from a story, usually a fic, in accordance to the genre. So, did it give you a shit ton of fan service? Did it make the badass a real badass? Did it fulfill all your tropey needs? Did the characters have sex in every chapter? Things like that. Chinese readers actually use this as a metric for Danmei fic, and is a tag in genre in its own right. So if you are just really wanting to be satisfied with all your wildest dreams, like, yes, you've hit every beat, everything that I could possibly want, this is what satisfaction is. And then another one we have is White Moonlight. So this is a person that the male lead has essentially always loved in some capacity. Maybe it was their first love, maybe it was their crush at school, a crush from childhood, something, but is unobtainable in some way. And usually this is associated with having a very pure and innocent image of said person. A lot of the time it's sort of that sort of first love, innocence from childhood is usually what white moonlight refers to, but obviously not always. And then we have idiotic white sweet. So these are characters or stories that sort of exhibit a naive, innocent, and sweet nature, but to a excessively dumb or sort of saccharine level. This can be both derogatory and just a descriptive term for someone's preference. But just think a character or a story that is like just you know, that too frottingly sweet type. And then we have sweet spoiled, so this is just a story with extreme fluff, zero angst. Green tea, so this is a character archetype who is pure, demure, shy, etc. on the outside, but is actually very scheming and manipulative and often gold digging on the inside. And this character is usually the show, so the bottom. So basically, a character who seems very shy, sweet on the outside, but is actually very cunning on the inside. That's what a green tea is. And in contrast to that, we have White Lotus, which is a character who is very pure and innocent unironically. So that's just how they are. And then again, in contrast, we have the Black Belly, which is someone who appears outwardly pleasant and nice and innocent, but is actually secretly conniving, manipulative, and potentially cruel. So this is a much more excessive version of the green tea. Black bellies can be both the gong or the show, although I've personally seen it occur more with the gong. The drinking vinegar is just a term used to describe jealousy. So if in the narrative a character is drinking vinegar, that means they're really jealous. Again, this is usually the gong who's the jealous one. And there's eating dog food, which is a descriptive way to refer to a couple who acts very sickly sweet and uses very excessive PDA in front of single people. So the single person having to witness this sickly sweet couple is the one who is metaphorically eating the dog food. And then lastly, we have sand sculpture. So this is just a really dumb comedy, basically. Alright, so now we're going to move on to naming conventions. So when I introduce Danmei to people, my friends especially, one of the things that seems to trip people up the most is the names, especially when it comes to historical or fantasy set Danmei. So I'm going to give you a brief rundown of how the names work, because I know that's one of the things that gets people the most. So just like in Japanese and other cultures, the name order is surname or family name first, and then followed by the given name. So last name, first name. Chinese surnames specifically are usually only one syllable, although there are a couple of two-syllable surnames as well, but that's usually it. So usually you'll be able to tell which is the first name, which is the surname because of that. And people's full names are at maximum 4 syllables, although 2 or 3 are the most common, so Chinese names are not long by any means. So once you get the hang of them, they're pretty easy to remember. Now, calling someone by both their surname and given name is the sort of neutral, normal way to refer to a person. So obviously, in English, we typically refer to people by their first name, sometimes their surname, it depends, but very, very rarely do you address people by full name. But in Chinese, this is the standard way to refer to someone. So if you have someone called Li Qing, you will just always call them Li Qing most of the time, for example. And I really must emphasize that in Chinese, nobody is ever referred to by a one-syllable name. It just does not sound right in Chinese. You will never catch anyone doing it. In English, it's fine, of course, but in the Chinese language, it simply doesn't work. So again, if you have someone called Li Qing, you would never call them Qing, just Qing on its own. But instead, you can use these single syllable names and make them multi-syllable by either repeating the name or giving some sort of honorific or affix to it. So with the example of Li Qing, you can't call them Qing, but you can say Qing Qing, for example, or you can say A Qing. R is basically a sort of suffix to denote affection. Now, in contrast, if someone's given name is more than one syllable, so if it's 2 syllables, you can refer to them by given name only if you are close with them. You shouldn't do that to someone you don't know very well. It's considered quite rude. But for example, Zhang Xiaoxi, for example, can be just called Xiaoxi because that's more than their first name is more than one syllable, so that's fine. Now, courtesy names. Again, one of the biggest trips. So, in addition to just birth names, traditionally, this doesn't happen anymore, but traditionally, Chinese people were given additional names, typically upon reaching adulthood. And these were to be used in formal settings and by peers, so people within the same generation. You don't see this in modern day, but if you are reading any sort of historical Danmei, especially Danmei set in the ancient world, there is a fair chance that you will come across characters who have both a birth name and courtesy name, and that can be confusing because you're thinking, oh god, why does this character go by 50 different names? I'm so confused. Help me. You'll get used to it, and I promise you that it is just as confusing to Chinese readers as it is to us sometimes. Especially when characters also have titles as well. So if you have a character who's some sort of military general, they may also have a special title with their ranking, so as well as a courtesy name and a birth name, so it's all very confusing. But just so you know, if you do read some historical Danmei, you may come across courtesy names, so that explains why some characters may have more than one name that people refer to them as. Obviously, which name someone calls them by depends on the relationship they have. And lastly, in fandom spaces, you will often see name abbreviations, so this includes character names and the names of Danmei titles. Again, a lot of people who have sort of seen Danmei out in the wild often ask me, what are all these weird abbreviations? I'm so confused. It's fine, it's just a way for everyone to refer to things quickly because some titles can be very long, so it's very common to abbreviate names and titles into acronyms. So for example, the character Wei Wuxian is often abbreviated to WWX, for example, as a shorthand. So if you ever see people talking about Danmei and you just see a random string of letters and sometimes numbers, it's probably either a character's name or the title of a Danmei. And people also do this with Chinese celebrities as well. Alright, so now we're moving on to a bit more of a serious topic, but definitely one that cannot be understated and should never be understated, really, and is a really important topic to talk about when we discuss Danmei and its current status in the world. So, again, as I'm sure many of you know, China has quite the grip when it comes to state media, online censorship and the like. The Chinese government really likes to try and control what is being said and portrayed in media, online, etc. despite its popularity both within China and outside of it, Danmei is often at risk of legal action by the government. And this is because it essentially breaks two social taboos in one shot, and that's homosexuality and pornography. Because porn within itself is illegal in China. However, the laws regarding its possession and distribution are very unclear and hazy. The problem with quite a lot of Chinese laws um, is that they'll say something's illegal, but they won't really outline what the consequences are, what counts as being what, um, and the rules just seem to change depending on the day and depending on who's in charge of what. Very unclear, makes it very uncertain for everyone. Sometimes they let things slide, sometimes they seem to use excessive punishment. It's very blurry, very hazy. No one ever really seems to know what's going on. So that's the status of porn within itself. But in regards to homosexuality, despite it being decriminalized back in 1997, the laws surrounding queer content and the creation and distribution of it being really ambiguous at best. What is subject to censorship and what isn't, again, very blurry, very uncertain, very confusing. Even queer media that isn't explicit can be subject to censorship, but also sometimes isn't. Again, very unclear. So this already makes the status of Danmei at risk constantly, because one moment the government may seem to not care, the next minute someone's getting thrown in jail. It's very confusing, very stressful for everyone. So, regarding Danmei, it was affected quite largely by anti-porn crackdowns in 2004, 2010, 2014. And this actually resulted in the closure of many Danmei websites and forums, most notably in 2011, where one specific large Danmei website was both shut down and its founder was fined and jailed for 18 months for having hosted the site. Earlier, I talked briefly about the first live-action adaptation of a Danmei novel, Addicted. So what happened in 2016 was that Addicted aired online via streaming services online, and just after the third episode aired, the series was just suddenly removed from all mainland Chinese streaming platforms before it had finished airing. So after episode 3, it just went yoink. It's gone now. Overnight, no warning, just suddenly disappeared. And soon after this, guidelines were published that banned television portrayals of what they called abnormal sexual relationships and behaviors, and this included same-sex relationships. These impacted web dramas specifically, which historically had far fewer restrictions than broadcast television. As I said earlier, content online has historically had less sanctions on it than sort of public broadcasts, so newspapers, television, movies have way stricter rules than stuff online, but as we can see, online censorship is creeping very rapidly, and then more stricter regulations continued in 2017. Now, what the producers of Addicted did is they ended up releasing the rest of the series on a platform outside of China, so it is still fully accessible to watch. If you want to find it, I would really recommend it. It's very sweet. There was a second season planned, but that seems to be in the eternal limbo. It's very unlikely we'll ever see it, which is very unfortunate. Because Addicted, it wasn't an explicit show, but you know, it didn't hide behind subtext. It was very clearly LGBT, and because of this, all other Danmei adaptations, at least the live action ones, thereafter opted to use subtext instead, and thus were censored, whereas Addicted was not. Now, as a continued new tradition of this, in 2018, shortly after releasing its first episode, Guardian, which is another live-action Danmei adaptation, was actually, again, pulled from streaming platforms for, quote, content adjustments to clean up TV programs of harmful and vulgar content. And then it was later re-released with either edited or deleted scenes. And in that same year, in October, a Danmei author was actually sentenced to 10 years in prison after she self-published one of her Danmei novels that featured rape and a student-teacher relationship, and which sold over 7,000 copies, and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison for that. Then, a couple years later, in 2021, Word of Honor, another live-action adaptation which received global acclaim, came very close to facing a ban due to its lead actor's blacklisting. So, again, even the actors are not safe. One of the actors got blacklisted for participating in a Danmei adaptation. And while the Chinese government's internet cleanup campaign, as they called it, targeted Danmei content, this led to further heightened censorship. And then a series of state media criticisms and new regulations, which included the Central Propaganda Department's directives, specifically targeted Danmei adaptations because at this point in 2021, as I said, Danmei and these adaptations had started to really, by this point, rapidly grow in its popularity, in its success, and in eyes looking its way, both within the Chinese mainland and abroad. So basically, the government had all eyes on Danmei and Danmei adaptations from this point on, and this actually caused a really sharp decline in the production of these adaptations. Because of this rapid targeting and censorship, a lot of Danmei communities ended up having to self-police purely just for its own safety, for its own interests. Xinjiang Literature City specifically actually asks its readers to report explicit work for deletion, which has caused many works to now be locked or permanently deleted from its site in order to avoid state sanctions and legal issues. And some authors have tried to circumvent these restrictions by hosting the explicit portions of their work on Taiwanese literature websites that don't have these same restrictions. Sadly, though, this strategy has not kept authors safe from prosecution, and last year in 2024, several mainland Chinese Danmei authors who actually published on these Taiwanese BL sites, Huaitang Literature City specifically, were arrested and charged by Chinese police for this content. So now we get to the current reality of Danmei and its sort of legal status in China. So again, despite Danmei being what scholars are calling a significant economic and cultural force in China that may well be one of the few created in China cultural products that have gained a foothold in overseas markets and potentially enhanced China's soft power, hostility and fear runs rampant in the community. So despite how popular it is overseas. The Chinese government really seems to want to sabotage its soft power in this way, for seemingly no real gain other than just to censor queer and pornographic content. And very, very sadly, as recent as May 2025, so just last month, a further estimated 300 authors have been arrested, with more anticipated to come, purely of the crime of writing BL. That is all it is. And this is a really jarring juxtaposition because over here in the English-speaking world, more and more official licenses are being published, and more translations are being made of Danmei work. So while over here we seemingly are getting a new Danmei translation announcement seemingly every other week, authors are on the other side of China's Great Firewall are constantly facing threats of persecution and increasing fears and concerns about their safety. This is the type of thing that really upsets me when I see people online praise censored Danmei, praise Puritan type thought, because this is the reality we face when we allow this sort of thinking to thrive. This is the reality of what LGBT people, LGBT works, history, everything. This is what we have to face. This is our reality. And it infuriates me when people try and say that, sexist representation or pure and good representation is the only thing worthwhile, because I really don't think these people understand the danger that mindset comes with. Be aware that this is happening. Spread the word if you can. I've seen a lot of social media posts about this. Please support authors if you can. I've given a guide on how to do that in the handout. Now, despite the censorship going on when it comes to LGBT content in China, China actually has a really long history with queer expression. As far back as ancient China, male homosexuality has been recognized, discussed, and even romanticized, particularly during certain dynasty periods. References to male-male intimacy can be found in classical art and poetry, philosophical works, historical records, etc. It was extremely common among the Chinese elite for men in positions of power to have male lovers alongside having a wife, because it was still socially expected that a man have a wife in order to produce heirs, but in doing so it was also perfectly acceptable to have male lovers at the same time, very similar to Greco-Roman traditions. And it's funny because despite what some modern netizens will say about queer content in China and Asia in general being a sort of forced Western ideal, it's actually the exact opposite, because European missionaries, when they first came to China, actually took note of how open and public same-sex relationships were, and were really horrified by these so-called unnatural perversions. And in response, Chinese writers made fun of these missionaries for being so pearl clutchy, and actually reasoned that the only reason that they thought this way was clearly because these missionaries were forced to be celibate. It was simply their jealousy talking. It wasn't actually until the year 1740 that any sort of law against consensual homosexuality was even introduced. However, even then, punishments were relatively mild by these standards. It was 1 month in prison and 100 blows with bamboo, which by our standards is horrifying, but by Qin standards, it's very much a mild punishment. And even though there was this law, a lot of people, especially the elites, just kind of ignored it because there were very few actual documented times of people actually being punished by this law. This law was more customary than anything. Just like I said with the missionaries, Western science and philosophy was sort of the main culprit of the sudden rise of homophobia in China. And this was particularly relevant during the self-strengthening movement of the 1800s. The self-strengthening movement was essentially a movement to westernized China and Chinese thinking, and in doing so came homophobic ideas, sought to suppress what was viewed as an outdated tradition. And this continued into the early Republic of China, which actually led to the mainstreaming of heteronormativity and increased intolerance towards gay and lesbians. So again, Western influence. We kept seeing this even more during the Mao era. LGBT people were essentially invisible during this era, especially during the Cultural Revolution. Homosexuality was very heavily persecuted. Individuals were labeled as disgraceful and undesirable. And queer art and historical texts that showed homosexuality to be the norm were very regularly censored by the government, and some of them even destroyed. Thankfully, a lot of this stuff, especially the artwork, actually still exists, but mostly in private collections where they are safely far away from government interference, although it is very sad that the only way to preserve some of this art is via private collection, but unfortunately that's the way it has to be. In a way, we can actually view these Danmei authors as breaking a centuries-long suppression of same-sex eroticism and narratives, and we can gradually see this as a reclamation of China's queer history and culture, as well as a force of decolonization. So not only are these authors just simply enjoying queer stories, they are actively pushing against these neo-colonial ideals and sort of re-entering its roots and sort of starting to push away this outdated Western influence. Okay, so let's discuss a little bit about the Danmei audience and fandom, shall we? So globally, there is variation in consumer demographics. So a survey found that around 88% of Danmei audiences identified as female, 66.5% identified as heterosexual, 15.7% as bisexual, and 2.7% identified as homosexual. And as I said before, female fans of Danmei often refer to themselves as Fu-nu, which is borrowed from Fujoshi. Official translations of Danmei novels have been made in around 15 languages, with many others being fan-translated. One of the appeals that many Danmei fans have cited is that they find that equality between partners is a big part of the appeal of the genre, especially when you compare it to heterosexual romance. There is a notable growing interest in Chinese language, history, and culture amongst fans as a result of Danmei's popularity, and fandom itself has rapidly expanded, with Danmei being a growing subject in academic studies in both China and globally, despite being a genre that's only about 30 odd years old. It's very impressive. And interestingly, One of the main criticisms that Danmei has faced is that it's fetishistic and adheres to heteronormality, which has been very heavily challenged by fans, who often cite xenophobia and impositions of Western ideas of queerness as a result of these accusations, not unlike similar ones that other forms of BL face. We all know that song and dance. You don't need me to rag on about it, I'm sure. And another unique thing about Danmei and its fandom is the role of fan translations. Now, obviously, I don't think any of us are unfamiliar with fan translations, especially those of us who have been in BL or even just general anime and manga spaces for a long time. We've all watched anime that was fan translated. We've all read those questionable early translations of manga from the 90s and early 2000s. But fan translations play a really big role in the Danmei community. And I know that nowadays fan translations are a bit of a controversial topic. Some people are very vehemently against them, some people are very open, some people are kind of mixed. But at least in the Danmei sphere, fan translations are very widely accepted. With a couple of caveats, of course, but they are a widely accepted practice. And this is mainly because they have been cited as the main reason for the global spread of Danmei and its popularity. And again, due to the mass censorship that is going on, we can also see these fan translations as being a sort of archive to prevent the loss of these stories. A lot of the Danmei that has been fan translated, its original Chinese RAWs have actually been either deleted or locked online because of the censorship, but are still able to live on through these fan translations. So not only is it important for the widespread popularity, but also important in ensuring that none of this essentially becomes lost media. Now, because of how extensive and reliant fans are of fan translations, some publishers, like Seven Seas Entertainment, have actually sought fan translators to be the translators for official publications. Now, this decision has been met with mixed views. Some people are very supportive of this because the fan translators are obviously going to be very in tune to the fandom, whereas other people are more critical purely for the fact that publishers can kind of get away with not paying these fan translation the same wage as a professional translator would, as well as, issues when it comes to mistranslations, because it's one thing to speak a language, it's another to actually know how to translate. Translation is in fact an art form within itself, and some people say that although fan translations are great, when it comes to actual traditional publishing, that job really should remain with a professional. So that's the internal debate going on when it comes to that. And then, of course, when it comes to fan translations, an etiquette standard has been developed. So many translations, for example, can only be accessed after the purchase of original Chinese RAWs, in order to ensure that these authors are fairly compensated. So essentially, if you find a fan translation, they will say, hey, provide us with proof of purchase that you bought the original Chinese web novel version, and once you do, we'll give you access to the fan translation. this is probably the practice that is most encouraged, and the one that I would also encourage all of you to do. In the handout, I have linked to an in-depth guide on how to purchase the original Chinese rules if you are intending on reading a fan translation of any Danmei. You can look at that there. There's also members-only Discord groups that vet readers before allowing access. Others opt to share translations via Google Docs in order to avoid legal action, copyright violations, and unauthorized sharing of these translations as well. And another etiquette rule is that if there is an official translation being done, so by some kind of publication, the fan translators are typically expected to take down or lock their translations in order to encourage readers to support the official releases. Alright, so let's talk a little bit more about adaptations. So adaptations can take the form of manhua, donghua, audio dramas, and live action series, as I said earlier. Now, if the web novel format is part of the thing that's making you wary, I know not everyone's a huge reader, especially not a prose reader. My suggestion would be, if there is an audio drama adaptation of a novel, go for that, because audio dramas are significantly less censored than all the other types of adaptations. This is simply because it's a much newer medium and is thus way less regulated, although that is gradually starting to change. The government has kind of started to clue on to the fact, but it hasn't really been hit yet. So I would really very much encourage everyone, if possible, to go for the audio drama if the web novel isn't doing it for you, or if you did enjoy the web novel and you just want to have a different experience. Audio dramas, for the most part, are very high quality, very well done, very faithful to the source material, practically to the letter almost. So definitely what I would encourage. And manhwa adaptations specifically, so comic adaptations, even though those are also subject to censorship, so any sort of explicit sex is not going to be present in the manhwa, many artists of these censored manhwas will actually post the uncensored scenes on their personal social media for fans. So, for example, Modao Zushi manhwa, the artist, in the official publication, it's sort of a fade to black with the sex scene, but then on her social media, she posted the full sex scene, and it was great. We all had a very good time. So yeah. Now, as previously discussed, live-action adaptations have achieved major commercial success via both producers and audiences' negotiations with the demands of the Chinese government's censorship and broader consumer culture. So, despite the censorship, live-action adaptations have been extremely popular, very successful, although unfortunately, large budget adaptations have tried really hard to get through to the guidelines by changing explicit homosexual romance with a more homosocial deep friendship instead. And these censored changes are often called dangai. However, while this technique did work for a couple of years, again, the government caught on, and a lot of dramas that were completed, so filmed, edited, everything, have yet to be released because of state restrictions, which unfortunately seems to signal the end of a brief period of prosperity for the genre. So I highly doubt we're going to really see many live action adaptations anymore. I would be very surprised if they do. And if they do, I imagine it's not going to look anywhere like the original. They're going to have to do some real serious changes, and at that point it really doesn't feel worth it. So very unfortunate state of affairs. Alright, last but not least, recommendations, the fun bit, yay. I'm gonna just go through a couple recommendations. So I'm going to briefly talk about sort of the three most popular Danmei authors, and then I'm also going to give you a couple recommendations based on genre and what I think is generally quite beginner friendly. So, the most, I'd say, broadly well-known Danmei author across the globe is undoubtedly Mo Shan Tongshu, or MXTX for short. She has 3 novels out. That is the Scum Villain Self-Saving System, The Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, and Heaven Official's Blessing. If you have heard of any Danmei titles, it's very likely it's at least one of these, or you've at least seen some fan art of at least one of these characters across your timeline at some point. Very popular, very big, very beloved. I am no exception. I am a very big fan of Mo Shang Tongshu's work. To give you a quick summary of the 3 novels, so Scum Villain is about a college-age student who, after finishing a novel that he professes to hate, dies and transmigrates into the body of said novel's villain, who is the abusive master of the protagonist. He opts to treat the protagonist more kindly in order to escape the cruel fate from the novel, but instead ends up currying favor in more ways than he expected. And for Modao Zushi, or the Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, this is the story of a cultivator and necromancer who diverges from conventional practices and invents a controversial path of cultivation. 13 years after his untimely death, the protagonist is reincarnated and reunites with his former classmate and frenemy. Together, the two solve mysteries and battle monsters and seek to unravel a dark political conspiracy. And finally, Heaven Official's Blessing is about a twice banished, disgraced god who ascends for a 3rd time, and thus angering the heavenly realm. He is sent to the mortal realm to repay his debts and comes across a mysterious ghost king who he quickly develops a strong bond with. And together they uncovered dark secrets about the heavenly realm and about their own individual pasts. Second author is Priest. Priest is a multi-award winning author and is highly regarded in wider literary circles, so not just in Danmei, just in the literary world at large. She doesn't just write Danmei, she's also written other things as well, but obviously this is Danmei panel. She's written over 30 novels, so I haven't included an exhaustive list of her work, but the 3 that I think are probably the most accessible and the most sort of universally appealing is Guardian, which I talked about briefly, Modu, and The Defectives. Guardian is about a detective who investigates a mysterious death at a university, where he meets an enigmatic professor with whom he forms a deep, inexplicable connection with. And as they work together on various cases, their dark pasts and feelings are uncovered, which reveal a dangerous plot involving gods and ghosts that threaten the world. Modu. This is a novel that centers around a police captain and a wealthy young man with a troubled past, and together they investigate a series of interconnected criminal cases and delve into the dark underbelly of the city, and this explores themes of justice, trauma, and human nature. And finally, for The Defectives, this is a space opera set in a futuristic world where humans live in a highly controlled so-called blissful society where their emotions, physiology, and even memories are managed by a neural network called Eden, which is supposed to ensure happiness and longevity. However, a group of defective individuals who cannot connect to Eden and are therefore seen as brain dead are exiled to the 8th galaxy, where they live in isolation. And the novel follows two revolutionaries as they plot to overthrow Eden's administrators and bring equality to the marginalized and the universe at large. And then thirdly, there's Meat Bun. She is incredibly popular amongst angst lovers. So if you love angst, if you love miscommunication, if you love a morally grey or just a straight up villainous love interest, you'll like her work. Her three current novels are Urha, or The Husky and His White Cat Shizun, The Remnants of Filth, and then Case File Compendium as well. The Husky and His White Cat Shizun is the story of a cruel emperor who dies and is reborn as his younger self with all his memories still intact. So he initially seeks to get revenge on those who wronged him in his past life, especially his cultivation teacher. However, as he relives his life, this cruel emperor begins to question his hatred and develops complex feelings for his teacher, and ends up embarking on a series of his own redemption. Remnants of Filth is about a powerful general who grapples with the return of his former lover who had previously betrayed him. However, his former lover has severe memory problems and constantly switches between affection and cruelty. And the story delves into their complex relationship, marked by past trauma, hidden secrets, and a desperate quest to restore his lost memories and escape a demon-infested island. And finally, Case File Compendium is the story of an elite young man with a hidden dark side, who returns from a trip abroad in order to pursue the woman of his dreams, only to be forced into a tense, complicated relationship with her older brother, who also happens to be his former doctor. The two end up getting entangled in a web of intrigue, violence, and conspiracy, which involves both the siblings, as well as the protagonist developing an obsession for his doctor, which pushes him to confront both his past and his twisted emotions. Alright, so my recommendation for sci-fi is Little Mushroom. Okay, so this is a story about a sentient mushroom who disguises himself as a human and forms a complex bond with a human soldier as they navigate a post-apocalyptic world plagued by mutated creatures and humanity's decline. This story explores survival, identity, and blurred lines between nature and humanity. The tags I would give it are apocalyptic future, black belly. So as we said earlier, this is a character who appears very sweet and innocent, but is actually very manipulative and conniving on the inside. Hidden identity, human, ex-non-human. One of the characters is a sentient mushroom mutation. Just trust me on it, it's great. Typical Gong Show dynamics and a slow burn. Yes, it sounds weird. Yes, it is weird. Yes, it's also one of my favorite sci-fi series ever. It is so good. Please read it. Okay, and for fantasy, my recommendation is Mistakenly Saving the Villain. I really like this one. This is a transmigration story, so it's about a medical student who wakes up inside a historical fantasy novel with the mission to save the protagonist from a life of slavery. Except he mistakenly rescues the antagonist, and instead of villainizing him, he actually decides to treat his trauma and help him find redemption. and together they face a dangerous world, using their shared love of medicine and growing bond to secure a happy ending. This is a transmigration, reincarnation, xianxia, yandere gong, ex-nerdy show, master-disciple dynamic, psychological drama pining story. Do note that this novel deals with the theme of forced prostitution and sexual slavery. Not between the main couple, but one of the characters is a sex slave and is very traumatized and deals a lot with coming to terms with his trauma and trying to heal from his trauma. If that is something that would be difficult for you to read, please consider skipping this one, but I think it's dealt with very delicately without being too OTT in its depiction. I think it forms a really nice balance, and I personally even found some of it very healing myself. So if you feel like you could tolerate it, I would really give this a go. It's definitely one that I enjoy very, very much. And then if you want something a bit historical, I would go with The Ballad of Sword and Wine. This is a very politics-heavy story, but very worthwhile, very satisfying. It's an enemies to lovers story with a lot of action, mystery, and again, very plot-heavy. And this story is initially two characters who are on opposing sides with a mutual desire for revenge. However, they very quickly form a bond and navigate a treacherous political landscape. Again, very heavy on the enemies to lovers, so if that is your cup of tea, this will definitely scratch that itch for you. I'm a big fan of this one. This is actually probably one of my favorites, and it's become very popular as of recent, so definitely get on that. And then if you're looking for something that's a bit more slice of life, a little bit more fluffy, I would go with Run Wild. This is a very fluffy coming of age story, lots of hurt, comfort, very big on found family. The protagonist, after being kicked out by his adoptive parents, goes to live with his deadbeat dad, who's a gambling addict. Things seem very dire until he meets a young girl and her brother, who he forms a very strong bond with, and together they sort of navigate their own issues and learn to heal together. Very fluffy, very sweet. If you want a good comfort book, this is the one that you want. And then my last recommendation, which are a little bit outside the box, is 1 silver coin for a pound of demon. Plot summary: a priest was sold a mixed-blooded demon on his way home. The demon was cheap, so he bought the demon. What makes this story unique is, one, it's in the second person point of view, and secondly, it's a choose your own adventure story. So you, the reader, are playing the role of the priest who bought the demon, and you have to decide in each chapter what the hell you're doing. There are 5 endings in total that you can reach. One is the quote good or true ending, and then there are 4 bad endings. This is such a unique ride. I haven't read many Danmei or even BL like this. I know that the premise of it might seem very off-putting, and I was very much put off when I first encountered it, but trust me, it is such a good time, and you will get sucked in. Now, be warned that if you do not like dark stories, if the thought of reading something quite rape-heavy, abuse-heavy, gore-heavy, religious trauma-heavy, psychological horror heavy is not for you, avoid this one. I cannot stress to you enough how much you should avoid this if you can't handle things like that. However, for all my dark story lovers, please, please, please consider giving this one a chance, even if you think you won't like it. I promise you will be so sucked in like I was. I was not anticipating loving this story as much as I did, but it was such a fun time, and it's really well written and really well crafted, and the story itself is so much more complex than you think it is. Still dark, but it just very enriching. Really want to stress that if you are interested in giving something new a go, definitely try this one, and it's pretty short as well, so please give it a go. And that's it for the panel. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you found this informative, and I hope I've managed to convince at least some of you to give Danmei a go. Again, if you look at the handout, I have provided links to how to purchase Danmei, how to access Danmei. I've also included more recommendations. I've also included links to all the official releases, etc. So don't worry if you missed out on any of the information. I have provided very detailed guides, as well as guides to access audio dramas and the like. So please check those out, and thank you for watching. Enjoy the rest of your con. Bye!